Well, good afternoon. It is customary for a speaker to begin by saying how pleased they are to be here. Actually, I would change those words around a little bit to say I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and to be a part of the Bowles celebration. I had the good fortune, Edward, of meeting your father once by virtue of being on the Medical Care Commission in North Carolina. And everything you've heard about Mr. Bowles is absolutely true. He was calm, logical, thoughtful. And invariably, when on the Medical Care Commission, we had a tough issue to deal with. He was one of those voices within state government that could help you work through those situations and come to a very logical and clear solution that everyone would understand. I also have to say a word of appreciation 38 years ago of being on this campus. I arrived in the summer of 1970 and stayed through 1972. And it was a time for someone that had a degree in Western European history, arriving in a master's in business. That was a conversion unto itself. And I think what I got out of that, among many, many things, was a chance to grow up, but also an understanding that the facts you learn will change over time, certainly if you have long careers, and all of you will. But the process that Appalachian gave me was that ability to look at an issue, to analyze it, to think about it from as many possible sides as you could, and come up to a conclusion that would serve you well. And I will always say thank you to the professors I had for their ability to challenge the way you thought and the way you constructed ideas and put together the rules and the processes that you were underway. It's also a little bit of a surprise, but an absolute pleasure to be on a stage with Keith Crisco. Keith and I developed friendships about 10 years ago working on a project. Now, you may have heard Keith and I are both farm boys, one from Cabarrus County, one from Stanley County. We both went to small, religiously affiliated undergraduate schools. We've both worked for a long time. But the one difference, Keith, is I went to a graduate school that was very practical. And I have that advantage over him. Keith is a Harvard grad, if you don't know that. About 20 years ago, my family and I were having dinner one night. And my daughter at the time was probably 12 or 13, and she looked up at me over our normal dinner conversation. And I had been with Endowment about 5 years, I guess, then. And she was beginning to figure out what her father did for a living. And she looked at me over the macaroni and said, "Dad, just how hard is it to give away money?" And that became a joke for our family, and one that I've told around the office at opportunities like this. And actually, the writing of the check process is obviously very easy. You just sign your name and put the check in the mail. But the harder part about giving away money is, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you hoping to see happen with that gift that you're making? And so what I'd like to talk about over the next several minutes is that interaction of what the business community can do, and I would put many of us in that world of the business community, and how we look at the not-for-profit world, as I rephrased it, the independent sector, and how my theory over time, if those two work together and are really thoughtful and bear on the strengths that each of them have, that they can together help us improve our communities and build places where we want to live, to have our businesses, to make our business successful, and where our families will thrive and do well. Now, I don't mean this to be a commercial for Mr. Duke or the Duke Endowment, but I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about him and his vision as a business person in the early part, well, the middle part of actually the 19th century. Because I think it's instructive in two ways. One, how you do build and innovate and use technology. And then also, when you accumulate great wealth, what do you do with that great wealth to benefit the society? So the story of the Duke family is that Washington Duke, who Duke University is named for, was a prisoner of war during the Civil War. He was in a prison camp just north of Wilmington, North Carolina. And after the war, he was released and was given the chance to walk back, and he walked back to Durham. And actually, I Googled the distance. The Duke homestead just north of Durham is 161 miles from where we are today. And the story is that when he got back, what he found left after being away for the Civil War were his two sons, a daughter, a wife that had passed away, and supposedly a blind mule. But also in the corner of one of their barns, there was a little bit of tobacco that was left over. Now, for those of you that are Southerners like I am, I would paraphrase to say a little bit of tobacco that the Yankees hadn't stolen on their way going back north. Nevertheless, but the Duke family took that tobacco, chopped it up, and the way that you sold tobacco in that day was to put it in small pouches, often with a drawstring. And so out of a tobacco wagon, they began to sell tobacco. Now, the Duke family and their company, Washington Duke and Sons, was actually one of the smaller tobacco companies in those northern counties of North Carolina and southern Virginia counties where tobacco was so prevalent in that day and time. But they began selling that, and like many other many firms or families were in that business, almost as many as you would say fast food restaurants are around today. Duke's break was the use of technology, because in the mid-1880s, he found a young inventor in Richmond, Virginia, that figured out a way to take tobacco, spin it, and put a piece of paper around it. And obviously you can sell a lot more tobacco in the form of a cigarette than you could in pouches. And that became the first technological break that the Dukes employed. But his real genius was amalgamating various businesses. As I said, tobacco sales was a very cottage industry at that time. And between the mid-1880s and 1900, Duke amassed about 90% of the world's tobacco market. Now, you've had enough business education to know that if you've got that kind of market share in a consumable product, you can make a pretty good income. And certainly the Dukes did. So much so that they ran afoul, or they were affected by the Sherman Antitrust legislation in 1910 and were forced to divest, along with Rockefeller, Carnegie, and other major industrialists of that day. And Duke decided to get out of the tobacco business. And so the firms of Brown & Williamson, American, Lorillard, R.J. Reynolds were all part of the Duke conglomerate that were split back into the companies that we know today. Being a business person, though, Duke turned his energies to other ideas. One actually was with the Mellon Bank, the people that formed the Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh. And they worked in rivers in Canada building electrical plants, which is a brand new technology at the time. And some of the descendant organizations that came from that work was one, Alcoa Aluminum. But Duke also was approached by two doctors that had been working in South Carolina. And they had an idea about building electrical plants in the South. And Duke, I think, saw the wisdom of that and worked and invested in them, and that gift actually became what we now call Duke Energy Corporation. Because his theory was textile plants were moving out of New England on their march south. And that was during the era when they were stopping over in the Carolinas and other southern towns. But you had to build a textile plant near water so you would have power. But what if you put the electrical power plant near water and then put up distribution lines so you could put a textile plant anywhere you wanted to? And therein began his second fortune. In many respects, his greatest fortune was from the power company. Duke in 1924 worked and set up what is now the Duke Endowment. Did it by a will of trust. And he did by setting aside $40 million of Duke Power Company stock. Unfortunately, he died 6 months later and added an additional $60 million to it. And so, essentially, with 1925, the Duke Endowment began with an original gift of $100 million, which obviously in 1924 is an awful lot of money. Duke charged the endowment, to work in 4 areas: healthcare, higher education, care of children, and Methodist churches, since they were Methodist, had been ministered to by a Methodist family. That gift, for those of you that have interest in investments, and I'm sure there are many in the room, that original $100 gift has now grown to almost $3 billion. And in that same period of time, we've been able to contribute $2.7 billion back into the Carolinas. But the numbers are not the important part. The part that I think Duke was trying to do, and the lesson that I think bears for us today, was that here was a native of the Carolinas that had started a major business in this state and knew that it was going to produce and do well. And so he set aside a large portion of his stock into a foundation to give back to the people of the Carolinas. So if you think about it, he had a business that was constricted in these 2 states, generating income, but yet use a foundation to plow those dollars back into the betterment of the society in those two states. Because I think Duke was smart enough of a business person to understand that if the Carolinas did well, if the Carolinas thrived, if the people that were Carolinians were successful and grow, then Duke Energy would also grow. And he saw that partnership between the two. And that's what I'd like to elaborate on for a few minutes today. In some respects, by picking the four areas that he did, Duke selected his own nonprofits to work with. But if you notice when I said by four, he didn't say just any comers send me a request. He was very specific about the areas that he wanted to work in. And also within those four areas, he was very specific about what we could do with each of those. So let me move to a second. So if Duke selected those four parts of the nonprofit sector, then just what is the nonprofit sector today? Well, I use the phrase independent sector because that's often the way that it's referred to. For example, if you think about our larger economy, a big portion of it is obviously business, corporations, small businesses, family businesses doing what they do. There's also a world of government-related agencies that Mr. Crisco now represents. But in between, there are all of those organizations that we think of that are not-for-profits. The hospitals, the museums, the orchestras, the public radio, the soup kitchens in our communities, even the National Rifle Association and the Sierra Club, Habitat for Humanity, all make up that group of what I call the independent sector, which I think is vital to the fabric of our society today. If you think of that independent sector as a business itself, it would represent and employ about 13 million people, or 10% of our workforce. Said another way, if you put together finance, insurance, and real estate, everyone that worked in those three areas, that's about the same number. That's about 13 million people, the same number that work in not-for-profit organizations. So when I had the opportunity to speak to a group of MBA students this morning, I encourage them, when you begin a career search, don't exclude 10% of the economy and 10% of the opportunities where I think there's some awfully good jobs and whether you can also contribute greatly to what is our society. We think, too, how do these not-for-profits support themselves? Initial reaction is probably, well, we all make donations to them. In actuality, about half the money that goes into the not-for-profit sector comes from services they render. Think about when you go to a musical play or to an opera or you walk into a museum, you buy a ticket. You know, that's that 50% that supports their operations. There's another 25 to 30%. Many not-for-profits, especially in social services, are operating under contracts with local government agencies. It's easier for a government to contract out these services than build that infrastructure for themselves. And often they can contract with somebody that's got a particular expertise and skill set to deliver that very effectively. And that last 20% does indeed come from donations that keeps them going. The last several years, especially the last two, as our economy has suffered, has been particularly hard on the independent sector. If you think about it a minute, as businesses have contracted, shrunk down in size, it has been the same time that demand has exploded for the not-for-profits, because it has been people that have lost their jobs, their lifestyles have been upset, have to turn to other organizations for help. So in the worst of all worlds, the business model has really grown for many nonprofits. Not long ago, I picked up a magazine that came to my desk, and I looked at just three headings that were there. One was, donors plan to give the same or less this year than last. Church giving drops as economic pressures mount. And lastly, nonprofits struggle to keep up with suburban poverty. You know, suburban poverty is a whole new dynamic that we've not dealt with. We usually talk about poverty in terms of inner city or rural areas. But with the economy we've had the last 2 years, there have been more and more of our neighbors in suburban, middle-class America that have been adversely affected. And a lot of the people that have come to help that changing population have been the not-for-profits. Now, I don't want to seem that I am apologetic or defending overly not-for-profits. Trust me, they have their issues. And it's issues that, as a founding organization, we work with them a great deal, trying to improve and trying to make them stronger. First of all, many of us think that we probably have way too many not-for-profits. I looked and I've heard the statistic and I tried to verify it, but what I remember is the Internal Revenue Service approves a not-for-profit in this country about 1 out of every 3 minutes. You think about that, 1 out of every 3 minutes, a new not-for-profit is being created. The good side of that is that it's given us capacity to meet need. The downside of that, it means that we're perpetuating a cottage industry where there's a lot of fragmentation and often in some of our large communities an awful lot of competition among well-meaning people and competition for very limited resources to run what they do. The other dynamic that I see in nonprofits, which is somewhat different, often very different from my days in the business world, is that there's a very strong organizational pride about people that work with nonprofits and about the entity that is that nonprofit, often because it's a first-generation organization. Many of our nonprofits, the founders are still around because so many of them have been created in the last 30 and 40 years. And as you know from studying business, that transition from a founder to a larger corporation and a business, that ability to pass it on to another generation or to other stockholders is often made easier simply because you have capital stock to trade or to pass along. But in a not-for-profit, you don't have that. You have the presence of a founder and the pride that they have in what they created. And that is often a very difficult dynamic for them to deal with. One of the more interesting case studies that Harvard Business School uses is actually about Habitat for Humanity, where they had gone so well and become so popular, but it reached that point where Millard Fulmer was ready to transition out. And the difficulties that Habitat had in coming to that model of leadership that was going to lead it into the next generation. And we see that happening over and over again in nonprofits. Largely, I think, because it is such a cottage industry, there's so many fragmented services. The third issue that we deal with a lot in nonprofits is what I would call a sore lack of infrastructure. You know, thank goodness they're motivated this way, but if they get $5, $4.50 of it they want to give away or put into programs. And they're very reticent to invest in their own operations. And so often we will go into not-for-profits and we see way lacking information systems, staff development, numbers of managerial staff, training of individuals that we don't see near to the degree on the corporate side. And so a lot of our work as a foundation is trying to beef up and to be sure that they have those kinds of resources. And lastly, one dynamic that we see also, there's a difference between the two worlds, is that there's often not the sense of failure in the sense of organizational failure in the not-for-profit world. In for-profits, you have that ability to either sell the company or somebody with a better idea through the economics puts you out of business. Nonprofits, when they get in trouble, often just shrink down and continue to limp along or either cut their services some way. But it's very unusual for a not-for-profit on its own volition to go out of service, go out of business. But that's not always the case, especially in healthcare is one of the examples where I think we have seen much more of a move towards more of a corporate model, to use that phrase. And if you think about just Watauga County in this immediate area, when I began with the Endowment, there were 5 hospitals in this area. Now they're all under the Appalachian Health System, based here in Boone. To me, that's a far better outcome for medical care in the high country area, because instead of 4 small providers, they are together. They can balance the resources, they can build off a scale, and they can bring economic and professional pressure to the questions of delivering health care. And while we wish we could see much more of that occurring, and it is beginning to, but it is an awfully slow process in many of the areas in which we work. A good friend of mine, in talking about, who writes a lot about not-for-profits, also bears interesting points of comparison between the for-profit and the not-for-profit. One which, as an organization, we're spending a good bit of time on right now is the concept of scaling, or is bigger really better? in a corporate environment, often we will judge success by, are you able to replicate yourself? Can you satellite a new organization here? Can you franchise your idea? The difference we often see in a service provider is really because you're working with the human condition more times than not, is that the scaling horizontally is more problematic than we would like. And so what we try to encourage not-for-profits to do is think about scaling, but scale vertically. For example, if you're really good at delivering a service, and you can prove that you're good at service, maybe you're better off in just doing more of that service on the same site or with the staff that you have. If you're doing 100 of whatever the service is, let's try to grow to 200 or 300 rather than moving horizontally to other communities, which is a different mindset than we see often in other places. Secondly, there's a difference in not-for-profits of innovation and impact. Clearly, we want innovation. I can tell you from 30 years of taking in grant requests, a high number of the grant requests we've received will often start off with, "Dear Duke Endowment, we're here. We're going to create the new model to do X, Y, and Z." I can also tell you over 30-some years, I've seen very few of those new models actually become models. It becomes more of a mindset of using a verbiage of terminology to often sell for a donor. What I think the organizations often miss is how good is the service, and can we have impact in in that area you're trying to do. For example, one of the changes we're bringing into our child care grant making, child care services, especially for abused and neglected children, is an incredibly fragmented operation in both of the Carolinas. And we, for a long time, have had many good and well-meaning people try to figure out how to solve these problems. But there are, as I said earlier, there are usually always small, always very localized troubles. There's been a move in the last 5 to 10 years of taking academic research and really studying the delivery of child care services and doing things like comparison groups and double-blind testing. And so now there are models emerging that are proven, are tested, and we know exactly what works. So as a foundation, you're not funding replication as much as you're funding a fidelity to that model. So our strategy on this particular point is evolving so that if we can find that great program in Tennessee or Canada or anywhere else, our strategy is becoming, let's bring it into the Carolinas and fund it so it takes root here. In our sense, that's a much more appropriate way to scale services than regularly simply dividing and trying to get more and more doors open. And lastly, many of us as funders have also been part of the problem. We have asked organizations to do things that more often suited us. And not surprisingly, the not-for-profit organization would follow what the funder wanted to do because the funder was writing a check. And I think we've been guilty of leading them into a mission creep, of doing things just on the edge of what they're really good at. So we've probably been part of all of this too. Now, why have I been talking about the good and the bad of not-for-profit organizations? Well, it's because I believe, and the point of these few minutes, is I believe that we have a wonderful opportunity to bring the skills of business minds, of the skills that you're learning at Walker, the experience that you have of the alumni and friends of this school and other schools like this, and marry them with the sensitivity and the understanding of the community that not-for-profits have. And I think we will be much better served if we can find ways that we can get those two worlds closer together and in far more harmony with each other. And I think in doing so, we'll both be stronger, and we'll have stronger communities, stronger businesses, and stronger people. Let me elaborate a little bit from more the business side now. Hugh McCall, who many of you would recognize his name, was a longtime president and chairman of Bank of America Corporation. And led Bank of America during one of its more successful periods. McCall, not long ago, had an opportunity to have dinner with him, and he talked about his years at the bank. And he said, you know, when I became president, one of the challenges I had was Charlotte. And I looked at him and I said, Hugh, I'm not following. What do you mean Charlotte? He said, well, he says, the bank began to grow. We needed different skill sets. We needed people that understood different elements of finance and different financial strategies. And often our places for recruiting people like that had been in the competitor cities of Richmond and Nashville and Jacksonville. And so all of a sudden I found that I could only find these people in New York and Boston and European capitals. And so I realized that what I had to do in Charlotte and also in Greensboro, where there were two major locations of Bank of America, I had to help those cities become places where I could attract these people from other capitals into this city, where they would be happy residents, where their spouses would be willing to come, where their children would be entertained and challenged with school systems. And for the last 20 years, Bank of America's investment into Charlotte and other cities in the state has been absolutely incredible. Everything from fine arts to concert halls, even the downtown bus station in Charlotte has major funder was Bank of America Corporation. Because McCall understood that if Bank of America was going to be successful, Charlotte had to be successful. And if Charlotte was successful, by and large, Bank of America was going to do pretty well itself. Jim Rogers, your last bold speaker, who was here 6 months ago, talked about the cathedral thinking that was required in the energy business. And he used the analogy, if you were here, you may remember, that the people that started European cathedrals, that dug the foundations, that laid the cornerstones, were never the generation that saw the dome put on the cathedral. That it was always their son or their grandson, or in some cases their great-grandsons, because it took 400 years to build them. And what we're often missing in our society is that ability to think about a society that could build a cathedral. Because right now we're worried about quarterly reports and financial reporting and results on the stock market on a day or a quarterly basis. Or worried about the reaction of a news broadcaster on the 7 o'clock news tonight, whether they're going to like or dislike what we did today. And actually, we need to move our society to think longer term about what's good for our business and good for our society. And I think Jim is exactly right on that point. Fortunately, there are many, many good examples that are bubbling up now and emerging. I'm working with two organizations, two companies that we know from our business side that are also working with some of the not-for-profits we support. And they're doing two, I think, very interesting things. One is loading a day a month their information system specialists. The other one is loading their human resource specialists. So there's not a cash outlay going from these companies into these not-for-profits. But what the not-for-profit's getting is a very experienced person that's got all the background and the strategy and knows how to do HR and IT. And for one day a month is in this not-for-profit, making them better, making them stronger, helping them with that infrastructure that, as I mentioned earlier, not-for-profits are often so very lacking. And I think that's a great contribution that costs them essentially nothing. Miami, Florida is a good example of a community that's learning to share resources. If you've been to Miami or if you're from Miami, you know they've just opened an absolutely stunningly beautiful orchestral concert hall for their symphony. And yet the city of Miami doesn't have a symphony. What they've worked out is an agreement with the Cleveland Symphony that does its summer season in Miami and then plays in the winter back in Cleveland. Now, if you remember the orchestra, where do you all spend your summers, Cleveland or Miami? I mean, that's a fairly easy call. But what's happening is now there are facilities that are world-class quality in both cities that are being used by an orchestra. The orchestra, instead of now working one season, is working around the year. So their income is better. And it's all about two communities and the leadership there in those communities that understand that we can make this community better if we swallow some of our own community pride and share the resources that we have. We're also working with a very interesting new technology. It's called Benefit Bank. So it's a relatively simple idea, although it's been hard to pull off. But it's a computer software that you can put in libraries and grocery stores and any number of organizations. And for a person of lower economic means can sit down there with a coach and you can fill out certain information about your condition. And the software goes through and calculates what programs you're eligible for. Earned income tax credit. There's a module that's just been introduced that helps you calculate veterans benefits if you're a veteran. Pell Grants was a model that's just been added. So you can imagine this low-income person sitting down And finding a way in about 30 minutes of working through and using modern technology to understand what benefits they're eligible for, which they often would never figure out with the maze of federal government bureaucracy. The reason I tell this is one of the sites that is going in South Carolina is Piggly Wiggly food stores. Because Piggly Wiggly understands that if their customers have a greater income flow, they're going to do more shopping at Piggly Wiggly. So in a number of their stores, Piggly Wiggly is underwriting the computer costs and the computer access to put these terminals in their grocery stores. What a wonderful blend of a social need and a hardcore business, and a very competitive business with a very low margin operating. And we're seeing more and more schools, like Appalachian, that are paying more attention to the ideas of social entrepreneurship. And I suspect as we move forward, we'll see more and more of that. So those of you in MBA programs have also a flavor and an option or an opportunity as an elective to have time with types of organizations that I've been talking about today. Because I think in balance that will bring much more of a wide range, much more of a balanced approach as we go into life. And I applaud those schools, and I applaud Appalachian for the sensitivity that it will bring to a student body, which will be very different in the years future than it was when I was here, and teach a whole different skill set to the students. So in closing, let me make a couple of points. One, there's a difference between charity and philanthropy. And what I've been talking about this afternoon is more of the philanthropy side, which I think, prejudices it may be, much more of strategic action that you take rather than the charitable act. Let me see if this story makes the analogy clear. There were two men once that walked out, and they were walking along this river, and they noticed some 2x4 lumbers were floating down the river. And being concerned about the water quality, they got in the river and fished out the 2x4s, stacked them on the side. The next day they were on their walk again, more 2x4s. So they were back in the river pulling out these 2x4s. And they got more and more of their friends to help them because there were more and more lumber in the river than they could ever keep up with. And they were getting huge piles of lumber they were stacking on the side. That's a very charitable act. We will always have the need for charity. We see it on our 7 o'clock news with the horrible experience that's underway in Japan right now. We will see charity in Haiti. We'll see it in earthquakes in New Zealand and elsewhere. And we'll see it when we have floods in western North Carolina and in eastern North Carolina. And charity will always be with us and be a very important part of our society. The philanthropic stance, though, is a more strategic question. And so the friends of the two guys that were getting all the 2x4s out of the river, one man walked up to him and said, "Guys, do you ever think, who's putting the lumber in the river in the first place? Let's walk upstream and see where all this stuff is coming from." That's a strategic, philosophical decision. And in a lot of the societal issues that we try to work with, yes, you have an element of trying to solve today's problem, but you also have an element of trying to figure out what's causing it in the first place. I'm old enough to think back about social history in this country, and I can remember when seat belts were just coming to cars. And I suspect there's some of you here that remember buying a car with the first seat belt into it as well. Not long ago, I was with one of our interns, and I made the comment, we were on a plane together, and I made the reply, I said, "Yeah, it sure is nice that no one smokes on airplanes anymore." And she turned around to me with this aghast look, "You could smoke on an airplane?" I said, "Yeah, for a long time, you could be sitting beside somebody that was smoking." My point is that a lot of societal change comes from individual people, and it comes from local businesses that understand what individual people want. And so seatbelts came because the Saab car company started putting seatbelts on, and they were so popular that other car manufacturers said, well, to be competitive, we need to add seatbelts to our cars. Airlines began moving the smokers to the back of the plane. And all of a sudden, there was more and more clamor for the seats towards the front. And they realized that they could pass on smokers of having them smoking while they were on the plane. Well, I think that's a very important role for us, and the ones that we need strategic decisions that are working both with not-for-profits especially that have an interest in social policy, and companies that can give the wherewithal to make those come as to common actions in society. And actually, if you think further about it, what our government generally does is confirms it, not starts it. But they will eventually come around to see where society is and make the rules and regulations that actually give it impact and permanence, but don't start it at the very beginning. I have a friend who speaks a lot, and towards the end of a lot of his speeches, he will say to our group, you know, what we ought to be about is making our society safe for all of our children. I will add to that, we ought to make our society safe for all of our children, for our parents, for our friends, for our families, and for ourselves. And I think if we can make our society safe and healthy and productive, where we have educated people, then our businesses are going to flourish and do well too. I mean, what good does it do us to have a wonderful product that nobody understands how to use it, or no one has the cash or the resources to pay it? You're just producing in a vacuum. And yet, if we can find in a perfect balance of successful businesses that are doing what businesses can do best, and successful members of the independent sector doing what they do best, sharing learning, sharing resources, sharing what they all know how to do, and sharing the sensitivity that each of them bring to the human equation, we will all be better served and better off. So at the end of the day, I would encourage you to think about, where do you want to work? What kind of company do you want to work for? What kind of community do you want to live in? What kind of community do you want to play? And if you've got that image right, think about how that not-for-profit and that business intersect to make that possible. Thank you very much.